This is a recording for Daf Kafhe Amud Bet. We're holding on Daf Kafhe Amud Bet by the Mishnah. We're going to Be'ezras Hashem go to the end of the parak. We have to go a little bit fast. So says the Mishnah, HaChacham she'asar et ha'isha b'neder al ba'ala harei ze lo yisayna. So if you have a scenario where a woman was noder hana'ah from her husband, and her husband is going to divorce her unless she's matir the neder, and she goes to the Chacham to be matir the neder, and the Chacham does not, he refuses to be matir the neder. So in that case, the Chacham is not allowed to marry the woman, because as a result of him not being matir the neder, her husband divorces her, and it looks very bad. It looks like the Chacham and her, were involved in something inappropriate. But mi'ana u'shechaltza b'fanav, if a lady did miyun, or a ketana who was married by her mother after her father died, or in any case where miyun would be applicable, if a ketana does miyun or somebody does chalitza in front of a beit din, so Yisayna, one of the chachamim on that beit din, is allowed to marry that woman because he's part of a beit din. He's not a standalone individual. So says the Gemara, Ha-hetira Yisayna. It sounds like in the first case where you have a chacham that he was not matir the neder, so there's a chashad, it doesn't look right, and therefore he's not allowed to marry the woman whose husband divorces her as a result of this neder. But if he's matir the neder, he is allowed to marry her after the fact, which seems to indicate that we're talking about a scenario where the chacham could have been matir, but he wasn't. Now, it says the Gemara, if we're talking about that she went to one single chacham, so chad mimatzi matir, one chacham cannot be matir and neder. V'amar Rav, Amar B'chia Bar Avi, Amar Rav Amram, Tana, Hatarat Nedarim B'Shlosha. We have a teaching that teaches that Hatarat Nedarim, you need 3, and 1 is not enough. So Elav B'Tlata Michashide, if we're talking about that she went to a beit din of 3 to be matir her neder and they refused, so they're not chashudim. So we said only an individual is chashud. So how do we know that 3 is not chashudim? V'atnan mi'ana o shechaltza b'fanav Yisayna. We learned that if a lady does miyun or does chalitza in front of a beit din, and as a result of that she's no longer married, they are one of the people, members of the beit din, is allowed to marry him neshu beit din because he's part of a beit din. So why isn't it the same thing by hatarat nedarim? You need 3. So Gemara says, Le'olam bechad. Really, we're talking about that there's one chacham who is refusing to be matir the neder. Amar Rav Chisda, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, b'yachid mumche. Like Rav Chisda told him, Rabbi Yochanan, yachid mumche can be matir neder. Hachanam b'yachid mumche. Here also we're talking about a yachid mumche. He's a yachid who is a mumche. He is a baki, a professional, an expert. When it comes to nedarim, he can be matir neder on his own. And that's the case that we're talking about when we say that if the chacham is not matir the neder, then he's not allowed to marry her. But if it was a beit din who refused to be matir the neder, and as a result of that the wife got divorced from her husband, then the chacham is allowed to, one of the chachamim on that beit din is allowed to marry her. Okay, mi'ana u shechaltza. So we said in the second case of the Mishnah, if the lady did miyun or chalitza in front of a beit din, she is allowed to marry one of those members of the Beit Din. Ta'amad the Beit Din, ha-betrei lo. It sounds like the whole reason is because he's part of a Beit Din. But if there were just 2 people that were matir a lady from her husband and were allowed her to get married, so it sounds like one of them cannot marry that woman. Why is this any different than that which we learned that if you have edim that signed on a sedem ekach, right? 2 witnesses signed on a shtar that Reuven sold his field to Shimon, or they're signed on a get that Reuven divorced his wife. So lo chashu chachamim l'davar zeh. Chachamim were not worried for one of the edim on that shtar to go ahead and buy the field from Shimon, or one of the edim on the get to marry this woman. Chachamim were not worried about it. We said earlier, Beit Din sounds like 3 dafka, but 2 would be a problem. Over here, it says 2 is not a problem. So the Gemara says, no, Higufa kamash malan la'afugim miyun miyun b'fnei shnai. The whole thing that the Mishnah is trying to teach us is just that miyun requires a Beit Din. Really, 2 also we're not choshesh for. We're only choshesh when an individual causes a woman to be muteret, and then he marries her. But if an individual causes a woman to, but I'm sorry, if you have two people, it's not a problem. Okay, so kamashma lan miyun begimel. It's just coming to teach us. The whole reason it says mimneshu beidin is coming to teach us that by miyun you need a beidin to exclude, to be lafuke from the opinion that says that by miyun you don't need a beidin and two would be enough. Okay, ibayalu kanas maushe yotzi. So in the cases that we mentioned, let's say specifically this case, Machlok Rishonim, exactly what case is going back on, but for sure everybody agrees going back on the case of our Mishnah where the Chacham refused to be matir the neder. So let's say she wasn't, yeah, you're right, she wasn't supposed to marry the Chacham, but let's say she did. The Chacham refused to be matir the neder. As a result of that, the husband divorced her and then she married the Chacham. So ma'u sheyotzi. What's the halacha with regard to her having to divorce after she got married to the Chacham? Does she have to divorce him or no? Rav Kana Amar Kanas Motzi. Rav Kana says she has to divorce him. Rav Ashi Amar Kanas Eno Motzi. Rav Ashi says Eno Motzi, he does not have to get divorced from her. Tani Luhu Rav Zute Debe Rav Papi Kedivrei HaOmer Kanas Eno Motzi. So Rav Zute Debe Rav Papi, they taught that Tani Luhu Rav, Zute Debe Rav Papi Kedivrei HaOmer Kanas Eno Motzi. Like the man Damar that says Kanas Eno Motzi. Like Rav Ashi, that if he gets married, he does not have to be Motzi. Amru le Rabbanan le Rav Ashi. They said to Rav Ashi, Gemara Osvara, Rav Ashi, you said Kanas Eno Motzi. He doesn't have to divorce her. So Gemara Osvara, is this a Kabbalah that you have that you learned, or it's your own Svara? Amru Matnitini, he said it, I have a raya from the Mishnah. It says, Hanit'an mishivcha v'nishtachrera, or if a person was suspected of being together with a shivcha and then she became freed, or from he was suspected of being with a goya and then she converted, we say that he's not allowed to be kones. V'im kanas ein motzi, but if he marries her, he doesn't have to be motzi. What do you see from there? Alma bernana lo mafkinan. You see that from just rumors that are not really anything that would have major ramifications like Esherish or Mamzerut, just rumors that, oh, this guy was with a Goya or this guy was with a Shifcha, we're not Motzi. So also here that rumors that, oh, the Chacham didn't matir because he wanted to marry her, for those types of rumors after the fact that they're already married, Ein Motzi. And so also over here, by rumors that people are spreading these types of rumors, lo mafkinan, we don't cause them to divorce. Okay, says the Mishnah further. V'kulam, all of these cases where an individual is not allowed to marry the lady who he caused to be muteret. So shayu lahem nashim v'metu. If they were all married at the time, and then their wives died, and then afterwards they want to marry this woman, so mutar linaseh lahem, they're allowed to marry this woman because it's clear in that situation that at the time they weren't doing it for the purpose of getting married. They had a wife, they were happily married, and then their wife died. Now they're looking for another wife, so they're allowed to marry this woman. Or also, if any of the cases where those women they after the Chacham was he refused to the Chacham refused to be matir her neder and she divorced her husband, she got married to somebody else. Or after somebody came and said, your husband's not alive anymore, and she married somebody else. And then nidgarshu, and she got divorced, or she almanu, or she became an almana, muter linaseh lahem. She's allowed to marry the one who was matir her. Because that's an indication that it wasn't initially done for the purpose of this guy marrying her. She married somebody else and it didn't work out. Now she's allowed to marry this man. And also, the ladies in such cases are allowed to marry the children and the brothers of the individuals, even though they're not allowed to marry the individual themselves, but she's allowed to marry the child or the brother, the son or the brother of the individual. So if somebody brings a get to be matir a woman and he says b'fanei nechtav b'fanei nechtam, or if somebody says meit ba'alech and the woman is now able to marry, so she's not allowed to marry the individual himself who brought the get or who testified, but she's allowed to marry his brother or his son. Okay, so says the Gemara, Metu nidgarshu lo. So we said that if a person had a wife already and his wife died, he's allowed to marry the woman who he was matir. But if he got divorced from his wife, then he's not allowed to. So Amar le Rav Hillel Rav Ashi v'atani afil nidgarshu. But we have a different teaching that says afil nidgarshu, even if he divorced his wife, he's not allowed to marry the woman who he was matir. So our Mishnah seems to indicate only if his wife died, not if he divorced. And we have a teaching that says even if he divorced. So Gemara says, Lo kasha. Ha dehavai ktata, had lo havai ktata. When there was fighting beforehand and then he divorced his wife, so then he's not allowed to marry that woman. But if there was no fighting beforehand, when he was matir this lady, and then afterwards he divorced his wife, then there's not a problem. Ibaitema. Or the Gemara says, I can tell you another teretz, that both cases was when there's no fighting. Meaning, if there's fighting beforehand, if there's arguments beforehand and quarreling beforehand, so then for sure he's not allowed to marry the woman who he was matir after he divorces his wife. But if there's no fighting beforehand, it depends. Lo kasha ha de'argilhu. The case that he's not allowed to marry if he divorces his wife is if he's the one that initiated the divorce. If she's the one that initiated and she started the arguments and said, I want a divorce, so then he would not be allowed, then he would be allowed to marry the woman who he was matir. Okay, v'kulan shenisu. So we said in the Mishnah that any one of these ladies who got married to somebody else in the interim, and then afterwards they get divorced or their husband dies, she's allowed to marry this man. So just to recap, there are a few different scenarios where the man who's matir the lady is not allowed to marry her. One of them is he testifies meit ba'alech. He says, your husband, I know your husband is not alive anymore, and he testifies, and they accept her testimony, and based off of that, she's allowed to marry somebody else. In that situation, he's not allowed to marry her. And the second case, another case, is he brings a get, and he says, B'fanai nechtam, b'fanai nechtam. He testifies on the get that this is a get lishma, and with that get, she's allowed to marry somebody else. He's not allowed to marry her. Now, if she marries someone else in the time being, and she either gets divorced or her husband dies, she's allowed to marry this individual. So the Gemara says, Kasal kadatach mita mita v'gerushin ha'gerushin. The hava amina is that when a person says meit ba'alech, and then she's allowed to get married, and she goes and marries somebody else, and he dies, then she's allowed to marry that first individual, v'gerushin ha'gerushin. And also, if the guy says, he brings a get, he says, B'fanai nechtam, b'fanai nechtam, and then she marries somebody else and gets divorced, so this is her second divorce, she would be allowed to marry that first guy. So the Gemara says, this sounds not like Rebbe. Rebbe says after 2 times, there's a chazakah, right? Rebbe holds that after 2 times a chazakah, and she's a katlanit. If she marries one man and he dies, and then she marries a second man and he dies, she's not allowed to marry a third man, according to Rebbe. She's a katlanit. She has a bad mazal that her husband keeps on dying, so person is not supposed to marry her. So this sounds very much like Rebbe, because we're saying if the first guy came and he said meit ba'alech, so her first husband died, she's allowed to marry a second guy. Second guy also dies, she's allowed to marry the guy who testified now. So how could you do that according to Rebbe? She's a katlanit. She 2 times is a chazakah. And by gerushin also, according to Machlokes Rashi and Toso, whether there's such a concept by gerushin, if a woman got divorced twice, whether she's not supposed to get married a third time because of same idea of katlanit, bad mazal. Okay, so says the Gemara that no, not necessarily is like Rebbe. Lo mita gerushin, gerushin amita. Maybe the case of mita is going on the case of gerushin, and the case of gerushin is going on mita. Meaning, when the guy says meit ba'alech, she got married, she got divorced, she's allowed to marry him. And when the guy testifies, he's on the get, he says who brings a get, then she gets married to somebody else, and then her husband dies, then she's allowed to marry that individual. Okay, we said in the Mishnah that each of these individuals, even though the lady is not allowed to marry them, but the lady is allowed to marry their brothers or their children or their brothers. So, Ma'ishna mehaditnan hanit'an min ha'isha asur be'ima uvita uvachota. So the Gemara asks a question from Mishnah that if somebody is suspected of being with a woman, so he's asur to marry her mother, her daughter, her sister, because we're worried that if he marries into the family, she's gonna now be an isur karet on him, and he's gonna, be in the family. He's gonna be close to her, and he's gonna be nichshal in the isur karet on that woman. But over here, we don't worry about the man marrying. We don't worry about the woman marrying the man's relative. Meaning, if a man and a woman are suspected of being together, suspected of having a relationship together, so the man is not allowed to marry any of the woman's relatives, but the woman is allowed to marry the man's relatives. So the Gemara is asking why. So says the Gemara, Neshe legabe nashe shechichida azlan. Gavre legabe gavre lo shechichan. So answer number one is, when it comes to women go to women. So if the man and the woman are suspected of having a relationship together, so the man is not allowed to marry her mother or her sister, because her mother or her sister are going to go to her house also. They're going to invite her over. She's going to be around, and therefore we're worried that something will happen. But she's allowed to marry his brother or his father because he's not necessarily going to always be around, and we're not as worried of them doing anything inappropriate after the marriage because they're going to be less available. And it says the Gemara, another answer, Inami nashe de lo asran shechivatana hadadi lo kapdi hadadi gavre de asran shechivatana hadadi kapdi hadadi. Or the Gemara says another answer, that the reason that the woman is not, or let's say the reason that the man is allowed to marry the relatives of the woman the man is not allowed to marry the relatives of the woman, is because if he marries a relative of the woman, so the woman if he's mizaneh with her relative, she doesn't become asura on him. Their relationship is still allowed to continue. Therefore, we need more of a deterrent for him to not be together with her. Therefore, he's not allowed to marry in, because we're worried something will happen, because if something does happen, he's not going to have to end his marriage because of it. But when it comes to the woman marrying one of the man's relatives, so in that case, the woman is allowed to marry the man's relative, because we're not worried as much about anything happening, because her husband knows that if she's mizaneh, their relationship is over. Therefore, he's going to be very makbid to make sure that she's doesn't have any opportunity to be mizaneh. So the Gemara says, Iachi aviv nami. So the Gemara says, if that's the case, so aviv nami, by the father also. Meaning, we said in the Mishnah that she's allowed to be with his child or his brother of the one who was matir her to marry. So also it should be with his father. So the Gemara says, Lo mibaya kamar, lo mibaya aviv, the bazis mine. Of course, by his father, that the bazis b'nei mine, that his son is embarrassed of him. Meaning, if the son is the one who's chashud and his father marries, of course the son is embarrassed. Of course, he's not going to do anything. That's pashut. Aval beno de lo bazis, but by the father, who he's not embarrassed. Lo bazis aviv mine. The father is not embarrassed from the son. Meaning, the father is not necessarily going to refrain from being mizaneh with someone who his son married. I might think that no, it should be different. Kamash malan. Mishnah comes to teach me the chidush that by their sons is more of a chidush than by their fathers.